Thank you very much, Chad. That was perfect. Well, welcome back for our afternoon session. I want to begin by doing some other things. I hope that you all were able to enjoy a great lunch, and I want to thank our dining services, our custodial services, our facilities folks who do all of the work to make this conference possible. I also want to thank Campus Safety and Security. They've done a lot in terms of logistical preparation. And most of all, I want to thank you, the audience members. It's really great to see you all here, and whether you're watching us in person or on the live stream, we're really grateful. And again, if you're like me, you'll probably go back and watch these presentations many times in the future. I'll be looking for all of the mistakes I made, but then I'll watch them again for the content too. But one time through just to see everything I mispronounced. And finally, I would be remiss if I didn't thank Heroic Productions, who have done such a phenomenal job on the displays we have, on setting everything up, on the technical aspects. They, together with our GTS team and with the folks that are doing the live stream, really make this possible. So, without further ado, it's my pleasure to invite to the podium Kathy Lundeen. Kathy is the Distinguished Professor of Leadership and Ethics and a Professor of Management in the Department of Business and Economics, and she'll introduce our next speaker.
Hello, welcome back from lunch. Hello to our online audience. Thanks, Maggie and Tane, for helping with that experience. I have the pleasure of introducing a speaker who is no stranger to the Nobel Conference here at Gustavus. Professor C. Ford Runge, Distinguished McKnight University Professor of Applied Economics and Law at the University of Minnesota, joined us in 2010 for the 46th Nobel Conference of Making Food Good. Pulling from his decades-long research streams and policy consulting appointments about food in all manner of contexts, his work has examined subjects as the economic policies of school lunches, the geopolitical levers of hunger, and the economic implications of food as fuel sources. Here in 2025, Professor Runge examines sugar as the profoundly impactful commodity that it is, having had a critical hand in shaping economic systems for centuries. We have heard a lot about that today already. Global demand for sugar, indeed the sweetness that humans began to crave, has led to distinct outcomes. We have normalized access to sugar instead of it being solely for the wealthy and the elite. And Professor Runge investigates how that demand and access have led to the seriously problematic outcomes we've been hearing about, such as pervasive negative health impacts, ecological damage, human enslavement, and protectionist economic policies. Using economic logic and historical lessons as part of the toolkit of solutions addressing those problems is a moral imperative. Indeed, yesterday at his visit to Jeff Owen's economic literacy class, Runge noted that despite all the math, economics is not a social computational science, but a branch of moral philosophy. The global public has a deeply complex, centuries-long relationship with sugar and sweetness, one that Professor Runge helps bring to light. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. C. Ford Runge.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for that generous introduction. After the musical send-up, as I said to someone, I feel like maybe I should give a sermon, but I'm not going to. Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize winner in physics in 1965, for his work in quantum electrodynamics, a subject which I do not understand, was once asked to describe why he won the prize in a way that an average person could understand. He replied that if he could do that, he probably wouldn't have won the Nobel Prize. Carolyn Bertozzi's lucid lecture. And the entire tradition of this event is a refutation to Feynman's funny and characteristically acidulous remark. When I was asked to present a talk, I was nervous about appearing, frankly, in such distinguished company. But economists are always babbling about comparative advantage. In fact, I teach my students that comparative advantage means that you should do what you're least worst at doing. And after a while, I thought, well, I know what I'm least worst at, economics. So that's what I'm going to talk about. This talk then will focus and trace the economics of sugar as an edible processed commodity. As part of the human diet, its impact over the last 4 centuries has been profound. How the modern world has been shaped by commodities and their economic impact. Sugar as a commodity has been vilified for a host of evils, including slavery, colonialism, obesity, and human disease. And it has played an important role in all of them. But these are the result of human choices. Sugar is not the villain. The enemy, if there is one, is us. My analysis of processed commodity sugar and its history will discuss 5 basic economic principles. These are preferences as a foundation of market demand, complementarity and substitution in the creation of markets for sweetened beverages, the derived demand for labor and land resulting from the demand for sugar, protectionism as a force in distorting markets and spurring sugar alternatives, and unintended internal health consequences of sugar consumption and metabolic diseases arising from excessive sugar intake. I was going to talk a little bit about the sugar molecule, but I'm going to skip that. So, processed commodity sugar has played a role over the last several centuries in economic choices affecting humans both outside and inside the body, as the structure of this conference suggests. As the poet Goethe wrote in the early 19th century, nature has neither core nor skin. She's both at once, outside and in. So let me first focus on the first item, primal preference. A first principle of consumer demand theory is that economic decisions are founded on preferences. Economics treats these preferences somewhat misleadingly as, quote, primitive, unquote, meaning foundational. But in more direct language, economic theory takes preferences as given and does not look under the hood. By contrast, evolutionary biology suggests that adaptive behavior based on evolutionary biology results in the fact that we crave tastes because our bodies and minds needed certain foods to survive over thousands of past generations. To differentiate them from primitive, I'm going to call these preferences primal. 3 such primal taste preferences arose at early stages in evolutionary development. The first was for salt, the second for fat, and the third for sweetness. Salt is essential for electrolyte balance and fluid retention. Fat provides acids the body cannot make itself to produce energy form cell membranes, and make steroid hormones. But our final and central focus is the primal preference for sweetness as a source of fast energy. Second only to fats and oils, processed sugars are our most concentrated source of energy. But as we have heard over the last day and a half, we consume far too many of these processed sugar calories. Stephen Wooding, an evolutionary biologist, notes that our hominid ancestors were naturally selected for success in recognizing sweetness while foraging. The human species is an ape, and essentially a fruit eater. Apes get 80% of their calories from fruit, which is mainly sugar. The ability to perceive and prefer sweet tastes is thus grounded in our genetic blueprint. Ancient peoples went to great lengths to find sweetness from sources such as honey and tree sap. In the Valencia spider cave in Spain, an 8,000-year-old artist showed a woman raiding a wild beehive, carrying a basket to collect honeycomb. In North America, before the introduction of European metals, Native Americans evaporated maple sap using heated stones and elm bark containers, consuming hundreds of hours of labor to produce syrup and maple sugar. The genetic mechanism reflecting the taste for sweetness operates through receptor proteins on the tongue, together with other receptors along the entire digestive tract from mouth to colon. Specific receptor proteins, labeled TAS1R2 and 3, are encoded as a gene pair on chromosome 1. These genes are found almost universally in vertebrates, including not only humans, but monkeys, cattle, rodents, dogs, bats, lizards, and fish. Sweet-loving traits, because they confer an evolutionary taste advantage, may well be grounded in tens of thousands of years of Darwinian selection. But explanations based on natural selection and evolution are always conjectural. Less so are recent advances in neuroscience showing gut-to-brain connections underpinning a preference for glucose. Howard Hughes Institute medical investigator Charles Zucker, yes, that's his name, reported in 2020 that a region in the brain especially favors glucose and similar molecules. As Zucker put it, sweet is liking, sugar is wanting. Our work, he said, reveals the neural basis for sugar preference. Specifically, parts of the brainstem which are separate from taste sensors receive information from the intestine that travels via the vagus nerve directly to the brain. A similar but different gut-to-brain pathway operates for fat. My conclusion is that if economists had looked under the hood, they would have seen that not all preferences are created equal. Some are more equal than others, driven by the force of natural selection and more recently discovered neurobiological gut-to-brain connections. Such is the case with processed commodity sugar, setting the stage for its emergence as a global commodity in the 1700s, after millennia as an exotic luxury. This emergence was powered significantly by what economists call complementarity and substitution between sugar and other goods. These goods were cocoa, coffee, and tea. So let's investigate how bitter was turned to sweet. The transformation of processed sugar from an exotic luxury to a household staple occurred largely due to the development of sugar plantations in the West Indies. The result was a burgeoning supply and steady decline in commodity sugar prices as the colonial trade linking sugar, rum, slaves, and tobacco took hold from the late 1600s to the mid-19th century. Here, we'll focus on the enlargement of processed sugar consumption because of its use as a sweetener in 3 other commodities. We come now to the second economic principle affecting the demand for sugar, involving the characteristics of goods known as complements and substitutes. A complement is a good consumed in tandem with another. The result is that the demand for the 2 goods moves together. To demand one is to demand the other. In our case, the demand for cocoa, coffee, and tea led to increases in the demand for processed sugar because each characteristically bitter beverage could be made more sweet. Processed sugar was thus complementary to all 3. By contrast, cocoa, coffee, and tea were in competition with each other because they were substitutes, each made more palatable by the addition of sweetness. Like Coke and Pepsi, substitute goods compete for consumers' attention based mainly, but among other things, on price. The adoption first of cocoa in the 1600s, then coffee and tea in the 1700s, built successive and additive platforms of demand for sweetness as each drink competed with the others in the market for caffeinated beverages. The introduction of the 3 to the European market occurred chronologically, with cocoa the first to arrive, followed later by coffee, then tea. I'd like to now briefly review each complementary commodity and its role. First, cocoa. Originating in the Amazonian rainforest, cocoa was consumed in Central and South America at least 5,000 years before Columbus and the voyages of discovery. Mayan, Aztec, and Incan cultures used cocoa ritually, mixing it with honey, chili, and achiote, a red spice somewhat resembles paprika. Cortez, in 1519, observed its consumption and later brought it to Spain. The first bitter caffeinated drink to arrive in Europe, cocoa soon became the basis for chocolate houses, catering to elite consumers, for whom it was blended with sugar, cinnamon, cardamom, and other spices. The first factories making chocolate paste were built in Spain in 1580. By 1650, cocoa-based beverages were common in Italy, France, and England, where it was blended with processed sugar and vanilla, sometimes with milk added. By the mid-1700s, Diderot's encyclopedia treated its discussion of chocolat sold as a half cocoa, half sugar cake, a combination clearly indicating their proportionate complementarity. Next, coffee. Coffee, as we know, is now one of the most commonly consumed beverages on earth. It was taken from Ethiopia and Yemen, where it originated in the 14th century, to South India about 1600, Java by 1700, and from Java by Dutch traders to Amsterdam and Paris, and then to the West Indies and Brazil. The Dutch East India Company was the first to export coffee beans and to encourage their cultivation in Dutch colonial possessions. Although histories typically date coffee houses to the 1640s in Oxford or 1660s in Marseille, there were hundreds of coffee houses in Istanbul a century earlier. These followed and reflected Ottoman rule and alcoholic abstinence in Muslim centers. By the 1720s, coffee had arrived in the American colonies, supplied largely by the English. John Smith of Jamestown and Pocahontas renown had himself been in the Turkish service before coming to America and was among the early settlers familiar with coffee. American colonists sought to emulate the London and Paris coffee house culture. The Reformation had encouraged abstinence from alcohol, especially beer. Coffee and tea stimulated both sober thought and conversation, it was known. Coffee houses in London became the forerunner of London clubs. They were known as newspaper reading rooms or penny universities because a cup of coffee cost a penny, and served as fora for commercial transactions. Lloyd's Coffee House in London became the center of securities and cargo trading and helped launch the modern maritime insurance firm Lloyd's of London. The total amount of coffee imported to Europe was 4 million pounds per year in 1723. By 1788, it had risen to 100 million pounds, or by 25 times. In 1776, a Dutch writer observed that maids and seamstresses now had to have their coffee in the morning, or they could not put a thread through the eye of a needle. The middle and working classes thus began to rely on coffee, which was increasingly affordable due to plantation production. Beginning in the 1720s, coffee utensils and sugar bowls, like Martha Washington's, became common in European commercial and artisanal classes and expanded to rural places as coffee replaced beer as the first drink of the day. Coffee became, in Woodruff Smith's phrase, part of the invention of breakfast. Now, tea. In the 1660s, few Europeans knew much about tea, which had been reserved and protected through hoarding of seeds, plants, and knowledge by the Chinese dynasty. In 1685, the China trade was opened, and by the time of England's Glorious Revolution in 1688, tea had begun to take hold. While the growth in the 1700s of cocoa and coffee in Europe was dramatic, the growth of tea demand was astonishing. As the English historian C.R. Fay Riley noted of the English tea habit, he said, "Tea which refreshes and quietens is the natural beverage of a taciturn people. And being easy to prepare, it came as a godsend to the world's worst cooks." Perhaps more significantly, its ability to extend productive working time in textile mills and other factories, especially when dosed with milk and processed sugar, improved the capacity of workers, most of them women and children, to endure 12 or 15-hour days. The Factories Inquiry Commission of 1834 observed that tea breaks were then a regular part of a day's labor in the textile mills of Derbyshire and Lincolnshire. At upper levels of European society, especially in Britain and the Netherlands, tea time was institutionalized in the late 18th and early 19th century. Sweetened tea was accompanied by jams, jellies, cakes, candies, and savories and mincemeat, all of which required added processed sugar. In the early 1700s, annual British sugar consumption per person stood at 4 pounds. A century later, it had increased to 18 pounds, or by 350%. Shown together, the patterns of declining tea and sugar prices and increased consumption is striking, as shown in these figures. The first, obviously, economic data that I've produced. In conclusion, the power of complementarity and competition in commodity market formation during the rise of processed sugar is difficult to overstate. One economic assessment of this impact suggests that commodity sugar, coffee, and tea together consumed broadly across classes affected economic welfare more profoundly in the 18th and 19th century than personal computers in the 20th and 21st. The costs of these improvements were borne by those far away and largely out of mind. It took centuries for the abominable conditions of slaves living and dying on tea, sugar, cane, and coffee plantations to enter the consciousness and conscience of white Europeans. The 19th century complementarity of tea and sugar was implicitly revealed when slavery abolitionists campaigned to encourage tea drinkers to stint on their sweetener, to little obvious effect. Let me turn now to the third principle: derived demand for labor and land. A third principle, one of the most important in economics, is the backward linkage in the supply chain from goods markets, like the market for processed sugar, to the factors of production used to make those goods, such as labor and land. Just as the demand for tea led to a derived demand for sugar, so the demand for sugar led to a derived demand for human labor and arable land. Sugar making has always been, until quite recently, labor and land intensive, and remains so in most parts, or at least many parts of the world. Apart from its exploitation of slave labor, sugarcane is responsible for the destruction of land resources in producing areas of importance, such as Haiti, with contemporary implications for climate. The importance of derived demand for labor and land to produce commodity sugar are therefore important and key aspects of its story. Commodity sugar, like all the colonial plantation crops, including tobacco, cotton, and coffee, created a voracious and unremitting demand for human labor, most of which came in colonial times from the brutal coercion and involuntary servitude of people from Africa and the Americas. Although we tend to focus on US slavery and cotton and tobacco plantations in this country, only 4% of slaves forcibly taken from Africa were destined for North America. The remaining 96% went to the Caribbean, Brazil, and South America, mainly to work on sugarcane estates. In Brazil, it was said, without sugar, no Brazil. Without slaves, no sugar. Without Angola, no slaves. Throughout the more than 4 centuries of the transatlantic slave trade, about 12 million men, women, and children were exported from Africa, not including those killed during raids or who died in transit. This equaled, according to Nathan Nunn, an economic historian, this equaled about half of Africa's population from the first slave raids up until 1850. Life expectancy of slaves on plantations after arrival was roughly 7 years. This explains why the demand for more slaves was unremitting. A steady state was unsustainable due to constant death. Disease, brutal treatment, and malnutrition, largely as a result of subsistence on pilfered sugar juice from cut cane, as well as high infant mortality, all took their toll. Conditions in the sugar cane mills were also brutal. On Barbados, planters divided lands into equal portions of 10 acres and staggered planting and harvesting to guarantee a steady flow of perishable cane to the mills. Harvests between January and May required constant cutting, grinding, pressing to extract juice, boiling and potting into conical containers from which molasses drained, leaving crystalline sugar. Molasses was further distilled to produce rum. A famous passage from Matheson noted, "Those who fed the mill were liable, especially when tired or half asleep, to have their fingers caught between the rollers. A hatchet was kept in readiness to sever the arm, which in such cases was always drawn in, and this no doubt explains the number of amputee maimed watchmen." While sugar milling technology somewhat resembles and may have originated from mimicry of olive presses, the demonic conditions in sugar mills more closely resembled the harvesting of whale oil recorded in the same period by Herman Melville. On Ahab's Pequod, whale oil was extracted from the strips of blubber cut from the bloody hanging whale carcasses by whaler crews, then boiled in cauldrons. The skin cracklings or fritters of the whale were burned to heat and render the stinking blubber into oil, just as husks of sugar cane were used to feed the intense fires, boiling and condensing its juice. Today, it's surprising how much remains the same. As we discussed briefly this morning, while slavery may be gone in principle, modern sugarcane workers are still often treated like slaves. In a series on the sugar industry in Maharashtra state, which was mentioned this morning, the New York Times last year found that Coca-Cola and Pepsi both profit from a system that exploits young women by pushing them into illegal marriages, forced hysterectomies, and financial insecurity. Couples work cutting cane, receive advances leading to indebtedness, and pay fees for missing work, deepening this indebtedness. Their condition is defined by the UN Labor Agency as forced labor, amounting to a form of modern slavery. In an updated 2025 report, the New York Times noted that a recent ruling in Bombay High Court had finally addressed some of these issues. Neither Pepsi nor Coca-Cola offered comment. Next, briefly, a note on the factor of production land. The land needed to produce sugarcane in the colonial period led to large swaths of deforestation from Java in the east to Brazil and the Caribbean in the west. Like other plantation crops, such as modern palm oil, cane sugar requires land clearing. Once planted with cane, stands are heavy users of water and soil nutrients, which are poorly resupplied as plant residues are removed for use as fuel or burned. This has led to steady degradation of the land base, as suggested by recent studies of soil core samples in modern Hispaniola. Fourth, protectionism and cane sugar substitutes. Protection from foreign competition is often a response to price instability. As cane sugar emerged from the colonial exploitation of labor and land, it demonstrated the cyclical instability of all commodities, shown in this centuries-long price chart for commodity sugar. This chart shows clearly that commodity markets, as Benoit Mandelbrot wrote, often misbehave. When commodity markets misbehave, like an errant child, governments put them in their room. In economics, this is called protectionism. Protection is often coupled to the creation of safe havens for uncompetitive so-called infant industries, but it can also serve as an incubator for alternatives and a stimulus for the discovery of new substitutes and technology. Exemplified, as discussed in part by our friend Professor Bosma this morning, exemplified by beet sugar in the 19th century and high fructose corn syrup in the 20th. Professor Bosma colorfully describes in his excellent book, which I recommend, long but good, the development of an infant industry as it relates to sugar beets. In the 1700s, apothecaries experimenting with alternative sources of sweetness found that the beet root was sweet. In 1747, German pharmacist and chemist Andreas Marggraf discovered that sweet tubers such as parsnips and beets could be pulverized and their sugars extracted. As Aronson and Budos explain in A Brief History, it was as if a potato could reproduce the taste of chocolate. Marggraf's talented mentee, mentioned earlier by Professor Bosma, Franz Karl Achard, a Prussian inventor and scientist, had experimented with domesticating tobacco in Europe as well as weather balloons and electricity, like Benjamin Franklin. Parenthetically, Franklin had also advocated that the colonies abandon British sugar in favor of maple syrup. Achard now turned to mechanizing a cane sugar alternative in the form of the beet sugar industrial process. By 1799, he had contrived a small sugar beet factory financed by Frederick the Great in Silesia. Three critical factors surrounded this innovation. First, sugar beets were well suited to temperate climates and the heavy clay soils of Northern Europe. Second, Napoleon's protectionist continental system of 1806 blockaded British goods to European shores, driving up internal prices. Third, after slave revolts in Haiti and unsuccessful British efforts to put them down, France lost effective control of the sugar-producing Caribbean in 1806, having already ceded control of most of North America in the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. Napoleon's trade barriers held prices inside the continental system above the levels in the external market, which was saturated with British sugar from the Caribbean. Napoleon attempted at first to process and refine alternative sugars from apples, pears, and grapes in order to compete with sugar beets. By 1811, however, the little general finally turned to sugar grown from beets. And by 1812, Achard's factory designs were being built across Europe. Now converted from grapes, better for Chambertin, and other fruits to processed sugar beets, Napoleon ordered hundreds of students recruited for sugar beet academies. Yet his dream of beet-based self-sufficiency was swallowed up by the Russian winter of 1812 and the ultimate defeat at Waterloo in 1815. It was not until late in the 19th and early 20th century that beet sugar regained its footing, resulting largely from what Bosma calls, quote, a chain reaction of protectionist measures. In 1854, only 11% of world sugar came from beets. By 1899, it had risen to 65%, driven especially by major expansion of beet planting in Ukraine. Balkanization has been a persistent feature of the international sugar market, frustrating efforts at price stabilization. As Professor Bosma again observed, countries one after another established tariff walls to protect and foster their own sugar industries. Creating price stability on their national markets led to a further shrinking of the international market, which engendered its volatility. Next, high fructose corn syrup. HFCS, as it's known, like beet sugar, became a viable alternative to cane sugar largely due to protectionism, which encouraged technical innovation. In 1965, two Japanese scientists converted glucose from cornstarch into a fructose concentrate, ranging from 42 to 55% concentration, to produce HFCS. To make it, corn is milled to make a starch, and enzymes are used to convert it to high fructose corn syrup. HFCS 42, as it's known, is used mainly for processed foods, such as sweetened breakfast cereals, and HFCS 55 for sweetened beverages like Coca-Cola. While often targeted as particularly harmful to human health, HFCS appears to be similar but not identical with sucrose from a metabolic perspective. HFCS benefited from trade protection as an indirect function of protection for processed beet and cane sugar. In the United States, U.S. prices for sugar were supported beginning in the New Deal programs of the 1930s, as Professor Bosma mentioned. While tariffs have been used against foreign sugar in the U.S. since 1789, the New Deal legislation established quotas on imports from abroad to reduce supply in the domestic market and raise prices. This policy has been tinkered with, but over the past 90 years, the basic policy has been to limit imports to support domestic prices above world market levels, not unlike Napoleon's more short-lived continental system. The Sweetener Users Association reports that in 2024, U.S. consumers paid an average of 51.7 cents per pound for domestic sugar, nearly double the 26-cent world price. This differential allows HFCS to compete successfully under the umbrella of high domestic cane and beet prices, aided by subsidies to corn, which increase its relative supply and lower its price as an input to high fructose corn syrup. In summary, the economics of both beet sugar and high fructose corn syrup as substitutes for cane sugar have been tied directly to protectionist measures in the world market, which on balance contributed greater instability and volatility to prices. The misbehavior of processed sugar markets, in short, is an example of human design to promote economic order through trade protection, leading instead to greater disorder. My fifth and final economic principle has to do with the metabolic consequences of consumption. Someone once said that one should use the word finally in a talk in order to give the audience hope. So my final and fifth economic principle is related to sugar's story involving the choices over time in which we make individual choices that do harm to ourselves. Americans now consume 126 grams of sugar per day. U.S. per capita consumption is twice the average intake of 54 other countries, and more than 2.5 times the recommended World Health Organization intake of 50 grams. Economics describes damages resulting from negative externalities, such as air and water pollution, which is a fairly familiar concept, I think. Because these impose social costs as markets fail to account for their harm. Excessive processed sugar and carbohydrate consumption, from the perspective of human health, represents a negative internality, polluting our bodies with a surfeit of calories that we do not need, but do very much want. The primal demand for sweetness, as well as for salt and fat, is not only unregulated, as pollution at least used to be, but is manipulated to make us want more through advertising and insinuation of processed sugars into food and drink. Like air and water pollution, this results in social costs in the forms of disease, disability, and unnecessary death. 3/4 of the calories we get from the grocers now come from ready-to-eat, highly processed foods. The typical snack food has about 24% fat and 57% sugar. There is ample recent data showing that taxation of processed sugar could restrain excessive consumption at the margin. In September last month, the British Medical Journal concluded that taxes on sweetened beverages have proved successful in reducing consumption, and that 9 countries now have meaningful taxes on sugar in processed foods. There may also be alternatives to direct economic incentives, like tax, and people differ in their tastes for sweetness. This strongly suggests that cultural norms and surrounding eating behavior can themselves serve as incentives and can change. The encouragement of such norms by public health agencies and opinion leaders can have definite effects and be modeled to some extent on the experience with the changing norms surrounding tobacco. This discussion has then examined 5 economic principles that explain the role of processed sugar as a commodity. Primal preferences, the impact of cocoa, coffee, and tea in accelerating the historical demand for commodity sugar, the derived demand for labor and land in its production, the role of protectionism in stimulating beet sugar and high fructose corn syrup, and finally, the damages resulting from internalities affecting human metabolic chemistry. I hope that it has shed some light on these principles and may even have offered the hint of some meaningful remedies. Thank you.
All right, we've reached our last speaker. It's my pleasure to invite to the podium Janie Franson, who is a professor of biochemistry and molecular biology, to introduce our last speaker.
It is my pleasure to introduce our final speaker of this Nobel Conference, Chef En-Ming Xu. She is a world champion pastry chef, perfecter of butter cake, and co-founder of SIP, Extraordinary Drinking Chocolate. Like our Gustavus students, Chef En-Ming's professional journey